heavy moral burden. Are we, the students and other workers who comprise this institution, going to make sure that our work adds to the sum of human happiness or human suffering? The aim of this series has been to call attention to this fact, as uncomfortable as it is, and to begin exploring how we might go about creating a research community that really works for humanity and the environment. Earlier this year, we were joined by Richard Levins, Subrata Ghoshroy, Jonathan King, and Dr. Rushin Al-Sabak. Tonight we'll be joined by Subrata again and Noam Chomsky. Before getting started with the main event, I'd like to announce that next week we'll be having a follow-up meeting for Science for the People. And if you think that the issues we've been discussing tonight sound interesting and relevant, and if you'd like to help out with us, then I encourage you to come. Our major topics will be discussing future events for the summer and next school year, and also talk about making Science for the People into a recognized student group here at MIT, so that these issues can stay on MIT's agenda for the foreseeable future. Again, we'll be meeting next week at 6 p.m. In room 32-123. That's in the Data Center. And I'd also encourage you to, if you're interested, sign up on one of these mailing list sign-up sheets that should be floating around for Science for the People and Radius. And with that, I will turn things over to our moderator, Cosmo Lupo.
Okay, thank you. So I am a postdoc in physics here, and I just wanted to introduce briefly the first speaker of this evening, which is Subrata Ghoshroy. And he's a research associate at the Science, Technology, and Global Security Working Group of MIT. And this group is dedicated to making the world a safer and better place for humanity by providing independent and unbiased analysis of scientific and technical questions that affect the world peace. This includes, for instance, understanding and explaining to the policymakers and to the general public the technical issues underlying nuclear disarmament and proliferation. Subrata is the leader of a research project aiming at promoting nuclear stability in South Asia. He also focuses on the impact of missile defenses and space weaponization in global security. I met Subrata a couple of months ago, and so we are engaging in this discussion about science, whether science is for the people, how we can make science for the people in this world. And it was a great source of information and inspiration to me. So it's a big pleasure to me to leave the microphone to Subrata.
Thank you, Cosmo, for this generous introduction. But before I get going with my talk, I have to say a few words on behalf of the co-sponsor of this event, which is the MIT's erstwhile Technology and Culture Forum, which is now known as the Radius. And Professor Chomsky has been associated with that program, appearing more than 15 times in the last few decades on different programs for Radius. So it's a real honor to welcome back Noam Chomsky, and he's so busy, his time is so limited that we're grateful and honored to have him here. Just a couple more words about the Radius. This is the 50th anniversary of Radius, and it's an organization at MIT, a unique one, that has been encouraging substantive discussion and conversation about critical issues of our time. This program, of course, is an example of that conversation. Radius is committed to bringing the MIT community together to delve into the ethical dimensions of scientific and technological innovation and research and its effects on all members of the society. So Radius is very much grateful again to Noam Chomsky and the students who organized this meeting and the effort to resuscitate the Science for the People organization here at MIT. Times are very difficult. So my part is primarily looking at the history of funding of research at MIT, and with particular focus on the Pentagon. And Noam has the whole history about this from going back to the Vietnam War and what happened then. So we look forward to his looking back and looking forward on this issue very much. I just want to say a few words about the context. Why this meeting that we are having? Why do we need to talk about research on campus? Well, resources are finite. I mean, even for this most powerful and the wealthiest of nations, there is a huge deficit spending problem. The national debt is an all-time high. We spent $1 trillion on wars, and yet we have a serious problem with so many societal issues, our infrastructure, and so forth. And as we see, that societal problems are bubbling up every other day, yesterday in Baltimore. And so it is a legitimate question to ask, that why should we be spending so much money on military research when our military spending is 10 times that of many other nations like Russia, which is supposed to be was our Cold War enemy. And the Chinese spending is a little bit up, but still it's dwarfed by our spending of close to $700 billion. So along with the huge military spending, we also have a huge weapons research spending. So the redirection of scientific research away from military to the needs that are so important today, from climate change to reduction of poverty to the water crisis, that we need to think about this. And MIT students, they're smart students. People come here to get this degree from this renowned institution, but they are also part of the larger society. So we need to think about that. So first, let me give you a brief history, and some of you are familiar with it, and some of you also have listened to my spiel before, so please you have to bear with me. The historical overview of US government's role in science and technology, and what was the Cold War paradigm. And it's still the paradigm 25 years after the end of the Cold War, which is the military spending to spur the economy and so forth. And then I will discuss the problem with why is it important that we look at this huge spending on military R&D? Is it getting us the bang for the buck? And I would argue it's not. So there are not only ethical, moral issues thinking about war and peace, but we also need to think about the economics of military spending and military research. That is, misplacing of these priorities is economically not making sense. And that's the argument I would like to put forward today. So the marriage, as I call it, between science and technology and the military got going, of course, during the war. We had our radiation laboratory, etc. here that were the bulwark of the war effort, and then came the biggest of all, the Manhattan Project, to develop the atomic bomb. And many of our renowned physicists from here worked in the Manhattan Project, came back and became also very much against the bomb, which is a good example to have for people who actually worked on nuclear weapons that became the most strident opponents of nuclear weapons. When the war ended, the idea was, and this actually came from Vannevar Bush, as I read the history of, and Professor Chomsky can enlighten on that, that he became later the president of MIT. Vannevar Bush was at that time the advisor to President Roosevelt, science advisor, and his contribution to making this new strategy of, as the hot war ended and the Cold War started, to continue this massive spending on science and technology, to keep the scientific enterprise going, and which will give us this technological edge over the Soviet Union. At the same time, it's a win-win strategy that by keeping on the spending on the military, that we also can grow the economy as we were growing during the war. Now with the new rationale, it's a fight of communists. But regardless, it was going to help the economy. And also, the spending on military research spurred innovation, which is absolutely true. We have so many things to show for it, from the GPS to the internet and so forth. And but one thing which we pointed out, and Professor Chomsky talks a lot about this, is that on these kind of research, the public assumes all the risks, because the main research on fundamental issues that eventually sometimes lead to weapons, sometimes not, but regardless, the transistors and things like that were invented with the Pentagon money. So these cutting-edge research, the private sector doesn't want to do because the risks are too high. They are too distant the future. So you need government money to do this, and the profits, of course, end up with the private companies. So this is the other side of it, which is led to the growth of this huge military-industrial complex who takes the government money, does the research, sells it in the market, and makes money. And but today, so 25 years, so that was a Cold War priority: grow the economy, beat the Soviets, and so forth. Now, 25 years after the Cold War ended, we have no change in that paradigm. Today's defense spending continues to be 600 billion. It just came down a little bit because of the sequester and so forth, but still very, very high. It's higher than actually it was at the peak of the Cold War when you adjusted for inflation. And in tandem with the overall defense spending, you also have this huge spending on military research for weapons that we don't need anymore. I mean, if we ever did, these weapons are absolutely meaningless. They are also, because Taliban doesn't fight with stealth airplanes and radars that can detect that kind of speeds. How much is Taliban's defense budget? Those are the kinds of enemies supposedly we're fighting. And look at our spending. 70 billion in defense R&D, which is much higher than the civilian R&D. And that's the focus of my talk, is that much of this 70 billion called the defense R&D budget, it is the biggest gorilla in the room, but nobody will talk about it. MIT, when it's going to Washington, ask for more basic research funding, is not talking anything about this defense spending, the waste in this funds. We have money that we can redirect them, we can do good science, and not have wars. And if you look at the budget is incredible. It's $4 trillion. Imagine. It's a country's budget is higher than many countries' GDPs combined. And within that, defense budget, as you see the red and the slight sliver, so this little part that is actually called out, this is the chart, by the way, I should give credit to them. It's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This is the defense R&D, and this is the big defense budget. Together, it's over $600 billion, and this is the non-defense discretionary, everything. Education, energy, you name every other executive department's budget is here, lower than the defense spending. It's incredible. That's the way it is. And the rest of the stuff is all mandatory social security, etc. And look at the amount of, so along with this $600 billion defense budget, how the R&D spending has grown in defense. So this is the non-defense, and this lower part is the defense. So you wouldn't know that there was no war, Cold War was over, Soviet Union fell around here, but the R&D just kept going, just like the rest of the budget. So it just keeps growing. There's a little bit of it coming down here because of the economic crisis in 2008. And you can see here, there was a big increase. That's the Reagan increase of the Star Wars, and then this is the Bush increase. On this, now let me talk about the relationship between the universities and the military. This is a little bit of an older data. I just didn't have time to update it so much, but this is several years back. But I don't think the numbers changed that much. All I want to show is that if you look at the research done in certain disciplines, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, metallurgy, computer science, math, they're heavily, heavily dependent on the Pentagon. And it does not come for free. There is no such thing as free lunch. You can't just do research and say that this is only objective science, had nothing to do with the agenda of the military. It doesn't work that way. And I will say why, because it's showing, the MIT report came out 2 days ago on the what's called the innovation deficit, and I will show why that is happening. And so this one shows the MIT research expenditure definitely going up. Who's getting money from all sources? This green one is actually interesting. MIT doesn't want to talk about it, but that's all Pentagon, about $800 billion a year. That is at the Lincoln Lab. And administratively, the lab is separated from MIT, so we don't count this as research, but obviously our faculty and postdocs and grad students have a lot to do with the Lincoln Lab. So we just show our campus research, which is about 100 million now. So the Lincoln Lab is about 800 million, so that together we have about $1 billion+ that MIT gets from the Pentagon, and it's now number 4 in terms of its the ranking of the universities in terms of getting research funds. And this shows basically that the defense funding at MIT just continues to grow, even in constant dollars, but in real dollars, it peaked out in 2013, and it's a little bit less now, but it's a significant chunk of money that MIT gets every year. This is just the numbers. This is from the MIT report. You can see that the defense spending is actually, Pentagon research is the highest again. And Noam and I had some discussion some time ago how the character of research changed from the military to NIH and so forth. Yes, NIH is of course big, and but NIH funding has been coming down. So Pentagon again has picked up in the last couple of years as the biggest driver of campus research here at MIT. But here is the other one. That's the one I showed about Lincoln Lab, and see how the Lincoln Lab has grown from 600 million here to today's 800 or so million from Pentagon. It's a huge spending there. But what I said in the beginning, that this doesn't come for free. I mean, the Pentagon, just like they should, they have an agenda. Their research interests are not what you think we need for most of meeting our societal needs. It wants to work on electronic combat. It wants to work on cyber warfare. It wants to work counter space, which is actually, this is near to my heart, this counter space business, because this is where I just published an article, should be coming up next week or so, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, showing how much are we driving weaponizing space. And it's so destabilizing for the whole world to put weapons in space. And these are the interests of Pentagon. So this is a chart that I borrowed from the Pentagon. And if you look at MIT's research areas, and you have to sort of pay the piper. So now some of these are of course dual use, meaning they can have both a civilian use and a military use. But it was interesting. I was reading something. The computer science department is putting out something about their work on drone. Never ever they're mentioning what these drones are doing in Afghanistan or Yemen in having targeted killing that the president authorizes. And these drones need automated navigation, automated decision making, and a lot of these are coming from our great laboratories. And at least we should own up to these things. So what I should say is that the needs for research, really, in solving climate change, in solving problems with water, you can see what's going on in California, then we need the researchers in those areas. And you can get people psyched up to do really good science in this area. Science can be done in those areas. Instead, we're spending lots of money on this absolute wasteful missile defense. We spend billions in trying to find these IEDs, these improvised explosive devices. We can't come up with a solution for these IEDs. There is no technical solution, so where are we going to find it? And biodefense, too bad John King is not here. He could have talked a lot about that. Stealth fighter, and then I'll just show a comparative chart. So here it is. So this is our what we say and what we do. And clean energy, it's about $2.5 billion now. And missile defense, 10 billion. Missile defense has been drawing that kind of money since the 1980s, once Reagan started the Star Wars. Every year we're spending tons of money, and this level is called research and development. It hasn't produced a single piece of technological advance or science. It is bogus science based on a bogus threat. It just makes money for Boeing and Lockheed. And we spent, John Hogan was my supervisor when I was at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School. John said here in his speech, he is now the presidential science advisor. So John said here, we can't get 5 billion for climate research. We can't. It's 2.5 billion now. And he has been science advisor for 4 years. We can't get that money. And we spent 10 billion on this missile defense thing. Combined science budget, all these agencies, 14 billion. Look at nuclear weapons spending, 50 billion. And this is the president who got the Nobel Peace Prize, and then made this great speech in Prague saying that we will eliminate nuclear weapons. Not in my lifetime, but we'll try to do that. But 50 billion for that. And then if you look at education, well, it's a big number. I mean, yes, we spend money, but look at the R&D and the weapons budget, 190. I mean, this is incredible. Comparisons are just so stark. So, so I just want to quickly go into now about the problems of this spending in military science. And this is not just me. This is actually the insiders in the military science establishment called JASON. JASON, J-A-S-O-N, is an acronym for something nobody knows. But very famous scientists at MIT and Stanford and elsewhere who are part of the military-industrial complex, and they got huge security clearances. So they did this study and saying, we got problems with our basic research. And why? We spend, if you look at the defense budget and the military research budget, it's huge, 70 billion, as I said. But look at the part that does basic research, which the universities get, is only about 2 billion. It doesn't change. The other stuff just keeps going up, sometimes down, but mostly up. But this stuff is flat. Doesn't do anything. If you look at the end of the Cold War, it's a new thing. It will be boosted up to do other things, but no, it's just flat. So what I'm asking universities like MIT is to focus on this structural problem with this budget. That there is money, get rid of the waste, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. This is like total of 12 billion. So this is the basic research, this is applied research, and this is like building gizmos, prototypes, etc. And that mostly corporations build. But if you take the money, restructure it, put money here, which is more transparent, you can do all kinds of good work. But not as long as you're doing in a non-transparent way under the rubric of the Pentagon. And it is showing, there is beginning to show a degradation in the quality of science. As Professor Chomsky often talked about these fantastic things in the 50s and 60s, in the development in high-speed electronics and so forth. This is not happening. Pentagon is no longer driving the pace of technology development. It's happening in the commercial sector. Pentagon is the customer. But so what are you doing with the money? Money is not going down. So why is the quality going down? But here is the problem, that we have a structural problem. We don't have enough technical people in the government who can oversee these things. And I personally was involved when I saw this change that from small research driven by a principal investigator and a couple of technicians and really published in open literature, it's become now big projects. And peer review is not existent in many of these type of research. I'm not talking about the research in the university, but outside, within the Pentagon budget. And this is a chart from Royal Society. Now, it needs to be verified a little more, but the source is reputable enough, so I put it up. And it shows the number of citations of papers. And you can see the citations of US origin papers are going down significantly. And I've just verified a little bit of that, not exactly these numbers from the National Science Foundation. statistics also. And the Chinese are, of course, putting tremendous money to the research establishment, and it is happening. So there is, although this one does not show the quality of research, but it does show the volume of the output. And so here, MIT report just came out 2 days ago. It's called A Future Postponed, and why declining investment in basic research threatens a US innovation deficit. Now, I would argue it is not just that. It's not enough for universities and scientists to just ask for more money. We have to show where we can get the money. Somebody has to do the heavy lifting. I mean, you cannot escape the responsibility of not pointing out this total waste that's going on within the defense budget that we can tap and do good science and save our universities and our jobs. And you can just compare that. Here's the defense R&D budget, and here is the civilian budget. See how much they spend on basic research, this dark area versus in the civilian. There's a lot less problem in an SF budget than in the Pentagon budget. And also, personally, I was involved with the missile defense, so I know how much. Everybody knows about the $400 hammer and things like that, but huge waste in this program. But let me just end sort of an optimistic note that I see that in redirecting these research priorities, we have both challenges but also opportunities. We have challenges because research funds are scarce. People have to survive. They have to get their career. They have to pay their bills, send kids to college. So research funds are scarce, so we try to get wherever we can. And politicians face pressure from their constituents and contractors about jobs. And so it's very convenient also for politicians to just support any appropriation that says it's for R&D. Because who can be against research? Who can be against science research? So you put money in, and that the juggernaut just continues. At the same time, so these are huge challenges in this transition, but there are opportunities also. There's very strong public support now to cut defense budget. You've seen results of the survey from Pew Research showing repeatedly people are for cutting the military budget. And the restructuring of our priority that will improve our quality of science, foster innovation, and it will appeal to university researchers. And so it will also, this is the economic argument I'm saying, that the conventional belief is, oh gee, all the defense work creates all these jobs. You can retain jobs because you can move scientists from doing one type of physics to another type of physics, at least in the scientists and engineers who are starting out. And here is experience at MIT, when students actually rose up, and Professor Chomsky was giving speeches commuting between London and Boston in 1969 when the students took over the student center, shut down, and MIT got the reputation of being called Pentagon on the Charles. And there was we have read the report of William Pounds, Professor Pounds, who chaired the Pounds Commission to look at this relationship between MIT and his labs. Professor Chomsky was a member, and he had a dissenting opinion. And then there was another ad hoc committee during the Star Wars days. So my time is up, so so let me just finish by just having one more thought that the U.S. still is the strongest in R&D in the world, and it continues to attract the best and brightest. We still have a strong work ethic and a drive for innovation, but the Cold War priorities of foreign policy, defense, and science funding are not sustainable. Scientists can play, I believe, a crucial role in bringing about these needed changes in priority. And we must engage the MIT students, professors, and others in social and political issues, but must be part of the larger social movement to change its priorities. Professors and scientists cannot do them alone, but they must be part of this larger political and social movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Subrata. So we keep the question for later. And so Subrata mentioned the Pound Commission. It was established as a response to the protest of the students during in 1969. Some of you had a printed copy of the minority report by Professor Noam Chomsky. On the blackboard there is the link to the full report on a PDF. And I mean, in that minority report by Professor Chomsky, you can read these words. Those who develop science and technology have in their hands a powerful instrument of destruction and a set of tools and techniques for overcoming at least some of the problems of contemporary society. They cannot ultimately control the social use of knowledge, but they also cannot remain blind to the question of how their contributions are likely to be put to use under given social conditions. So what we would like to do is to start with the meeting of today and the follow-up meeting of May 5th, conversation inside MIT with the students, with the staff about this issue. And so with this, it's my honor to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky, our next speaker.
Does this work? Yeah, okay, no, dispense with these things. I'd like to leave plenty of time for discussion of all of these issues, so I will only add a few comments about the narrower question, the specific role of MIT and research at MIT. And I should say, when I was looking around the room, I was kind of pleased not to see too much gray hair. People who will remember what I'm talking about and have their own interpretations of it, which may be different from mine. I should add a qualification to this. I'm doing something I never like to do. I'm talking about a topic that I haven't really researched in any depth. And I'll be speaking mostly from personal experience and having participated in many of these things and what I've sort of picked up along the way, plus background knowledge about how things work. Actually, I think one of the, if you look over the last, say, 60 years period I've been here, one of the best ways to understand the research that's going on at MIT is to just walk around the neighborhood and notice what you see. So if you walk around Kendall Square today, what you see is the largest Pfizer, pharmaceutical corporations, biogenetics, and so on. Why are they there? They're there because they're vultures. They're trying to rip off the research that's going on under public funding in MIT. MIT is technically a private university, basically funded by soft money. And the cutting edge of the economy in recent years has shifted to biology-based. Earlier it was electronics-based. Still is to an extent, but there's a shift. And as a result, the environment is changing. So now the immediate environment around is biology-based private corporations, which can see what they can pick up and market and so on from the publicly funded research that's done here. If you walked around 60 years ago or 50 years ago, technically not right around here, because then it was a working class area, industry and so on, a little farther out, what you saw as electronics firms, Raytheon, iTech, small startups that were being set up by people at the electronics lab, which were picked up by bigger corporations if they turned out to be successful. And the reason was that in those years, the cutting edge of the economy was electronics based. And therefore, you got the corporations that ultimately became the private parts of the high-tech economy. They were using the research that was done in places like Building 20, the old Building 20, RLE, the other departments here, to create where the work was being done that essentially created the modern high-tech economy. It's not 100% the case, but it's substantially the case. And the same is true of other major research universities. Now, at the time when the cutting edge of the economy was electronics-based, a natural way to induce or compel the taxpayer to pay for it was by shouting defense. Anything that was done in the 50s and 60s was called defense, like the interstate highway system, which is supposed to be one of the great infrastructure programs, was sold as the National Defense Highway System, with stories about moving missiles around so the Russians wouldn't hit them and things like that. But it was basically a part of a very general effort, essentially spearheaded by the automotive industry and the fossil fuel industry, to try to shift transportation from efficient electric transportation to highly costly and inefficient fossil fuel-based transportation. That's why we don't have railroads, why you can take a high-speed train from Beijing to Kazakhstan, but not from New York to Boston. In fact, the train from New York to Boston, the fast one, so-called, when it goes, it doesn't stop in the middle. It's maybe half an hour faster than it was 65 years ago. It's a long-term project. We're suffering the consequences of it now. But it was a well-designed in the program of industrial development used, which also incidentally did create a good part of the high-tech economy. If you have a computer, it's the internet, if you have an iPod, or whatever it is, a lot of it is based on technology that was developed basically in the state sector. And MIT was one of the main centers. So back in the 50s, when I got here, a computer was maybe the size of this auditorium, with vacuum tubes blowing up all over the place, and paper flowing everywhere, and nothing that you could sell to the industry. It gradually got down. So by, it must have been around 1960, some of the top engineers in the Lincoln program pulled out and found the first mainframe company, DEC, which was able to sell moderately sized computers to businesses, usually with subsidies. IBM was meanwhile learning how to switch from punched cards to digital computers, also picking up publicly funded research. And they did in the early 60s make a computer that was the fastest in the world, but they couldn't sell it. It was way too expensive, so it was picked up by the taxpayer. They went over to Los Alamos. And in fact, the first marketable computers that were really around the late 70s, that's decades after the development. The same is true of the story of the internet. The internet was privatized under conditions that are still rather obscure about 20 years ago, after decades of research and development, first within the Pentagon system, then under the National Science Foundation, but basically publicly funded. And now and I think I haven't really taken a look, but I suspect if you look at the funding of on-campus research, not all research, not including Lincoln Labs, but on-campus research, I suspect what you'll find is that Pentagon funding has declined and funding from the health-based institutes and corporations has increased. It wouldn't surprise me if that's true. It might be worth a close look. The bookkeeping details are very intricate. I discovered that when I was on the Pounds Commission back in 1969, which was the first effort at MIT to try to evaluate and understand what's going on university MIT research. That at the time included on-campus research, which we discovered was almost entirely funded by the Pentagon, something like 90%, which means, if you think it through, that much of whatever else was going on campus was also funded by the Pentagon indirectly through overhead and other bookkeeping trickery. So basically, the institute was overwhelmingly funded. And meanwhile, there were two labs, the labs, which is still administered by MIT, and what is now called the Draper Labs, and the instrumentation labs, iLabs. And it looked, the bookkeeping was so fuzzy that we couldn't really work it out. But it seemed that roughly 50% of the budget, rough number, was probably related to the laboratories, the off-campus laboratories. Whether they were contributing to MIT or were drained from MIT was not very easy to ascertain, because in those days, the bookkeeping wasn't very careful. Money was pouring in and sort of didn't know very where it was coming from and where it was going. But it looked probably roughly balanced, roughly cost and income probably in the same range. So that's what the picture looked like in 1969, the first attempt to really evaluate it carefully. We also discovered that on campus that there was apparently no directly war-related research. Where directly is important because almost anything that's done can be picked up somehow for war-related purposes. But there was no directly war-related research on campus, with a single exception, the political science department. Actually had something called a Peace Research Institute. And anybody with a brain function knows what that means. It was graduate students were going to Saigon to set up pacification work. Anybody knows what that means, and so on. They also had secret seminars, the only ones on campus that anyone knew about. But the only way I found out about it myself was when I was invited to talk upon one. Secret closed seminars. As far as we could tell, nothing like that was going on in the science departments. Maybe something was hidden, but we couldn't find it. But the on-campus research seemed to be not war-related in any direct sense. Again, lots of things can be war-related in an indirect sense. You can't stop that. But why was the Pounds Commission set up? Actually, I should say that for me it was a pretty tricky matter. I was asked to be on it by both the administration and students urgently, so I did. It was tricky. I was teaching at Oxford at the time and had to take 4 transatlantic trips a week to teach in the morning and come back to the committee meeting in the afternoon, go back the next morning. I was a lot younger then, but it was kind of a dream for about 2 months. But it was probably worth it. It was interesting. The commission was set up because there was a confrontation coming between active, radicalized, not radical, but activist students who were concerned about the military work on campus and the administration, which was trying to hold on to the status quo. And it was building up to a real confrontation. Nobody wanted the confrontation on either side. The dynamics of that were pretty obvious. And so how do you get out of the confrontation? You set up a committee. The committee was set up to investigate it, and I was, I said, kind of implored by the team, the students to be on it. Students wanted somebody on it, so they thought would be kind of sympathetic to their point of view. So the commission set up. That was the immediate background. The MIT campus had been very quiescent during the period of student activism. The idea generally was engineers they don't get involved in things. In fact, the campus was so quiescent that in 1968, January 1968, those of you who are very fair may remember that there was an amazing event in South Vietnam, something without any historical precedent. South Vietnam had by then practically been destroyed. There were over 500,000 American troops. There was an army of the client regime, maybe 1 million men. And every village was infiltrated all of a sudden, in January '68, there was an uprising, huge uprising all over the country, which nobody knew about. It was a surprise to the entire occupying army, that all its plans and everything else. I can't think of a comparable historical event, and it was very serious. It went as far as breaking into the American embassy, taking over large parts of the country. So that led to a major change in the attitude towards the war. Actually, what happened then tells you something quite important about social movements. The President Johnson, wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam, but the military was opposed. They said they would need them for civil disorder control if they sent more troops, because the country would blow up. Young people, women, minorities, they shouldn't be able to control the country. So they needed troops here, so they weren't sent. That's the last part of the Pentagon Papers, probably the most interesting thing in the Pentagon Papers, rarely discussed. But one of the things that the government did, there was pressure at that point from the business world to cut down the war. It was costly, it was causing stagflation, it wasn't good for the economy, and essentially no point to it anymore. And one of the various steps were taken to reduce the tempo of the war. It went on for many probable years, but it did reduce. One of the things that the government did at the time was try to make peace with the students, the militant students all around the country. And the way they decided to do it was to take the government official who came out of the university, turned out to be George Bundy, the former dean of Harvard, who everybody detested, so they didn't know that. And so they sent Bundy around. He was going to go to talk to students and make peace. And the first university they picked was a very safe one in the Midwest, where nothing had ever happened. Bundy went there and was cheered. Big report in the New York Times about making peace. And the second one was MIT, which looked pretty safe at the time, except that it just blew up the campus. It was a very interesting event. Some of you may remember. Bundy's performance was so outrageous that it just radicalized a large part of the student body. Kresge was full of the student center, and played a big role in increasing the activist character of the college university, which has already begun to pick up, mostly by a tremendously successful organizing effort of a couple of dozen undergraduates, like Howard, Shalom, and a couple others, who somehow turned the campus around very quickly until it became one of the most militant campuses in the country. And Mike Howard was in fact elected student president of the program so radical you could hardly believe it. All of this happened within a year or two. By late 1968 came the sanctuary student union taken over. But for about 2 weeks, the institute was practically shut down. Students at the student center protecting a deserter who had volunteered to be in the sanctuary, and that was very effective. And then the reaction to that was March 4th. There was going to be a student strike on March 4th, organized actually by a couple of physics graduate students. And to prevent the student strike, the administration made the sensible decision to call a day off. So there was one day in which classes were canceled, and there were meetings, discussions, seminars, and so on technology and society, responsibility of scientists, lots of questions like that, which had never really been, individuals had thought about them, but that hadn't much been considered. After that came the confrontations over the labs, and then the Pounds Commission, which gave some, tried to evaluate what was happening. There's a lot of interesting material there, I won't go through it. A lot of the books on it, which are pretty good, can't really explain what was going on behind the scenes because it was quiet. But basically, the Commons Commission ended up with 3 positions, which we, for convenience, we call conservative, liberal, and radical. The conservative position was that the 2 labs, I-Labs, Draper Labs, and Lincoln should remain on campus. But the liberal position was they should be severed from the campus. The radical position agreed with conservatives. I was one of 2 students. We issued a minority report. And we agreed with the conservatives, but for a different reason. Our reasoning was that if the labs are separated from the campus, it's going to be a purely formal administrative decision. Everything will go on as before. Students will go for seminars, interchanges, and so on. It just won't be visible. And we figured it's better for it to be visible. It's better to see on campus exactly what's going on, both for educational purposes, for organizational purposes, and even to monitor what's happening. So there were these 3 positions, and it's kind of a compromise. One of the labs, I-Labs, was associated, it's not technically separate, separately funded, and so on. And the other, Lincoln, remains, while the budget numbers have to do with that. Well, there was an earlier background. The student body had been quite quiescent, but there was activism in faculty of 2 kinds. One was the Boston area faculty group on public issues and the people around it, faculty. It was Boston, it was mainly MIT, and it was led by people like Saul Luria in biology and several others. There was also independently, and that was concerned originally with nuclear issues, nuclear war, nuclear weapons, ABM, missile, and all of those things. Although by 1965, it began to take a pretty mild view on Vietnam, mildly critical view on Vietnam. The mildness was not a reflection of the attitudes of people in it necessarily. Some of us, like Salva, Luria, and maybe a couple of others, were much more militant. So it was very hard at that time to come out in public with a serious criticism of the war. It's easy to think back and remember what the environment was like at that time. So, for example, we had our first attempt. There was an international day of protest against the war in October 1965, and we tried our first public demonstration in Boston on the Common. It was violently broken up, mostly by students, in fact. The breaking up of the rally was praised lavishly by the Boston Globe the next day. A couple of months later, in March, tried a second one that had to be in a church. Church was attacked. And the same is true of attitudes. So one of the people involved in anti-nuclear protest about nuclear weapons and so on was the physicist Bernie Feld, who was the editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. He was not a flamed radical, but he was condemned as a wild-eyed crank who left the reservation. He had fled from the reservation and had controlled him. That's George Kistyakovsky, who was consistent internal commentary surfaced later. Kistyakovsky was a former science advisor and kind of a dove, but that was the attitude toward criticism. And therefore, at the same time, in RLE, which was 100% funded by the armed services, there was a radical group developing which involved in organizing resistance against the war. In fact, one of the ironies of the time was that at a lab that was 100% Pentagon funded, that was the National Academic Center of Anti-War Resistance. And that tells you something about Pentagon funding. They didn't really care what we were doing. It wasn't really military funding. Of course, it had potential military applications, but they basically, I think, understood that they were kind of a funnel in which public funds came, poured through it, and created the high-tech economy of the future, which would be privatized and turned over to profit making. which is pretty much the way it works, and pretty much the way the system works now, with tuition funding. So the Pentagon, for those of you who are around, will remember, who were there at the time, will remember, was about the best funder you can imagine. They didn't care what you were doing. You didn't have to submit complicated grant requests. You just said, look, here's what we're doing, not much surveillance. Occasionally, a couple of generals would come around and pretend to be looking at it. But it was quite easy. In fact, some of the things that happened later really merit research. I've never seen research on it. But in 1970, as opposition to the Vietnam War was building up, there was a congressional amendment, the Mansell Amendment, which required the Pentagon to guarantee to Congress that all funding was military related. They didn't want other kinds of funding. My guess is, and here's a research project for you if you're interested, if you take a look at reports, say ARPA, not the ARPA, and ARPA reports for grants, I suspect what you're going to find is that before 1970, they just said, here's what we're doing. And after 1970, they probably started with some fakery about military applications and then said, here's what we're doing, which probably everyone understood. That's a guess based on anecdotes, but I can't really verify. Well, along with there have been other shifts too over the years. During this kind of neoliberal period, the last 34 years, there's been a shift towards the corporate funding. Corporate funding tends to be more short-term and application-oriented, and also introduces secrecy. In the days of Pentagon funding, there was simply no secrecy, aside from the political science department. Incidentally, the Center for International Studies was, in the early 60s, openly funded by the CIA. No need to keep it secret. It's, again, the atmosphere of the time. On campus, as far as I can tell, there was nothing secret other than that. Now there is secrecy. In fact, sometimes it's so extreme that a corporation can't impose secrecy, but as anyone who gets grants knows, that they can make it clear that if you don't keep it secret, you're not going to be refunded. And that's kind of understood. But sometimes that even in one case that I well known, reached a point where the scandal reached the front page of the Wall Street Journal. A student in a class had refused to answer a question in an exam, and the instructor asked why. He said, well, I know the answer, but I'm sworn to secrecy in a project by another professor. That, again, scandal. I suspect there's more of it. The corporate funding has a very cheapening effect, which Pentagon funding didn't. And that's one of the kind of complex factors in the way the society works that it's worth keeping in mind. Now, there was another shift that took place in the early 70s, which is more subtle perhaps, but extremely significant. I remember, a couple of other you may remember that around 1970, the head of the meteorology department, Joel Charney, and his counterpart at Harvard, Ray Seaver, head of the Earth Science Department, who were both personal friends of mine, several of you, I'm sure, but both came around with kind of grim faces, saying that they were getting evidence that looked pretty ominous. That they were getting the early evidence on the severity of the climate change catastrophe that we're racing towards. It wasn't much of an issue then. Didn't become much of an issue until much too much later. It's now a major issue. And we've been living for the last 70 years under two dark shadows. The one is the threat of nuclear war, which is very serious and it's going up. And the other, which wasn't recognized at the time, is the threat of environmental catastrophe. And it's not far off. out the next generation, the following generation could be extremely serious. Well, that's, by now that should, I mean, I don't think I talk about it here, I'm sure you all understand it. It's important to recognize, however, that the population does not understand it. There was just a study that came out. Yale University does regular polling on attitudes towards climate change. It came out with a recent study. I did not look up the numbers again, but I think it showed that in Massachusetts, which is one of the most educated, progressive states, I think only about 70% of the population that really think it's a serious problem. And anthropogenic climate change is even lower ranking. And if you go to other parts of the country, say the parts where there's a heavy evangelical population, the numbers are very low. That means a huge educational, organizational effort required to develop the kind of consciousness which will terminate the race to the precipice before we go over it, which won't be very long. And that brings the things that can be done right now. As I'm sure you know, there's a campaign on campus, I think student-led mostly, to divest from fossil fuels. Personally, I think that's a very good idea. I know the counter-arguments, and I think we can accept the counter-arguments as accurate. There's no reason to reject them. They're accurate, but the problem is they're irrelevant. The counter-argument is my feeling is that those who are involved should take this stand. So one counter-argument is it will be costly. But if MIT as an institution tells the world we're not going to stop the race to the precipice because it might cost us, what are we telling people? We're telling them, don't bother shifting your light bulbs from energy using the lead. Don't bother cutting down on your fossil fuel use. Don't stop heating your homes and so on. Because we don't care. We're not going to accept anything, any cost to us. So why should you accept any cost to you? That's basically telling people let's race to the precipice faster. Another argument is that if MIT doesn't invest, somebody else will, which is perfectly true and totally irrelevant. The purpose of divestment is not to injure ExxonMobil, and they don't care. It's to make it symbolic, it's education, telling the world that this institution, which does have a reputation and should live up to it as being a center of science, understanding, moral integrity, and so on. We're telling the world, look, you better pay attention to this. It's very significant and important. And my own feeling is that those arguments are, the counter-arguments seem to be essentially irrelevant, not wrong, but irrelevant. And I think it's one of many important steps that have to be taken and urgently if we're to survive, which is by no means a certainty.
Okay, thanks a lot to both the speakers. And I would like to open the question and answer session. And I want to ask for your help because we want to start something with this event to be the starting point of something good. And so I want to ask your help for helping us to be constructive in taking these question and answer sessions as a working place to build something together to make science for the people. Do you see the two microphones?
Thank you. I have a comment for Subrata Ghoshroy. during your talk, you kept talking about defense spending, and I think it's important to be careful about how we use words. The U.S. military doesn't do any defending. They only do offense, dropping bombs on people and invading countries and destroying societies and making places safe for U.S. corporations to plunder. And also, even if they were defending, the U.S. is stolen property of the Native Americans and has no right to defend itself and is ruled by billionaires and corporations. So the defense would just be of the property of billionaires that is like stolen from slavery and continued slavery and prison labor. So my suggestion, the U.S. government itself used to call the Defense Department the War Department, and they changed it as a strategy to call it the opposite of what it does. So my suggestion is, instead of defense spending, you put defense in quotes, or you call it offense spending or war spending, or like if you need a neutral term, then military spending.
Thank you. It really needs a response from Noam.
Right. In 1947, the War Department, which had existed since founding the Republic, changed its name to Defense Department. And anyone who had a gray cell functioning knew no more defense. You didn't have to read Orwell to understand this. So you're quite right. But it's very important to realize how pervasive this conception is, especially and it's particularly interesting in educated liberal circles. And so, for example, a couple of days ago, Canada, an example was actually published, that wasn't published. Right after can you hear me with this instrument? Is this working? Yeah. Right after the draft agreement with Iran over the nuclear issues, about which there's a lot to say, there was, of course, plenty of coverage. And there was a front page article in the New York Times, naturally, two like that. But one of them was a think piece by one of their analysts, Peter Baker. And it was basically favorable to the agreement, but it said there are real problems. We have to make sure we can trust Iran, which is engaged in aggression, terror, destabilizing the region, and so on. And therefore, we've got to keep our eye on them. And I gave a couple of examples, which were interesting. But the most interesting one, which passed without anyone noticing it, as far as I can see, was accepted. The most interesting one was that Iran is funding militias which are killing American soldiers. And that destabilizes the region. In other words, when we invade a country, destroy it, kill hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, drive out a couple million refugees, incite a sectarian conflict which didn't exist, that's tearing the country and the region apart, that's stabilization. If somebody shoots back, that's destabilization. Well, that tells you what defense is. And that's across the board. I mean, you can barely find a recognition that there's something wrong with this. So the New York Review of Books and the Journal of the Liberal Intellectuals also has an article on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, similar, praising the draft agreement, but again saying, gotta watch out for Iran. They're involved in aggression and violence and terror and so on. Actually, there are two states which are on the rampage in the Middle East, constantly carrying out aggression, violence, violation of international law, and so on. Both of them nuclear states, the United States and Israel. But that's not destabilizing. And in fact, if you ask yourself a simple question, why is Iran considered a threat? In the United States, it's normal, everyone says, the greatest threat in the world is Iran. Why? Well, actually, U.S. intelligence has an end that nobody with a brain functioning thinks that Iran could ever use a nuclear weapon, even if they had one, because the country would be wiped out in 30 seconds. But there is a problem with Iranian power, whatever it is. And the U.S. intelligence explains it. It says if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, it would be part of their deterrence strategy. And the two violent, aggressive states that are rampaging in the region cannot tolerate a deterrent. Obviously, why? But try to think of another reason why Iran is a threat. But it would be, going back to your point, the concept of defense is so deeply embedded that even mere truisms like this are inexpressible. This helps explain why in 1965, Gaddafi was making very mild statements about Vietnam. There's no point in speaking Turkish to people who only understand Swahili. And to try to talk about these things to the educated American public is kind of like talking a foreign language.
Before moving to the next question, there is the sign-up sheet moving. Can you please pass it around and then give it back to Paul for that? So,
I have a question for Dr. Ghoshroy. So you mentioned, I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot of waste in defense and that it's a misplaced priority. But at the same time, the benefit of having, I guess, research done under the auspices of the DoD is that it gives political cover to fund that research. For example, politicians are a lot more willing to fund or pay for research done for defense purposes than done, for example, by the Department of Energy and so on and so forth. Because then it gets more political and then Republicans attack it and so on and so forth. So my question is, by calling for shifting research away from the DoD, where there are dual use applications and it does eventually make its way into the marketplace, do you risk just cutting off all research spending whatsoever?
Well, I think that it's a good question, and this is the inertia of looking at this issue. That well, if we raise the flag about research under the Pentagon, then maybe we'll lose all research. Well, evidence is beginning to show there is a problem of keeping this juggernaut going. That if you don't say anything, the universities like MIT, going to Washington, and I happen to be there, that you come and simply ask for more money. It's just like another lobbying group that want, and as long as you get your million for the basic research, then you go away. We're not addressing the national problem that under the name of research, we are wasting. As I said in my talk, I showed you that the funding for basic research has been flat since the 60s. It hasn't gone up very much at all. Yet the defense budget and the so-called R&D budget has gone up dramatically. It's exceeding the Cold War level even in constant dollars. There is a tremendous amount of waste, and we just cannot avoid looking at it.
Hi, my name is Ellen Roster. I'm a Harvard alum, so I feel a member here, but I also work at MIT. I have a couple of questions. The first is, the DoD has been a bit of a reasonable voice when it comes to climate change issues, and they've done a lot of research regarding climate change. Do you think, since the DoD tends to be a co-setup for conservatives and Republicans, do you think the DoD has a role in shaping or influencing the hearts and minds of Republicans and conservatives towards climate deniers? And my second question is for Professor Chomsky. I think I can speak for everybody in the room that says it's a privilege to be in your presence. Two small questions. One, is there a particular book or author or concept that influenced you and something that you recommend people to sort of read and research? And my second question to you is there a particular question that you wish you had researched that you didn't get to do?
I like that, but Chomsky answer first. Any particular research that you wanted to do and didn't do, is that correct? And sorry, what was your first question?
That I wanted to do with them.
Yes, there's a particular research. And the other one, is there an author, a book, or a concept that sort of influenced you?
I get a lot of letters when I go home tonight, or a dozen letters asking me to recommend some books. And it's just, what people are interested in, what their level of interest is. It's it's a highly personal matter. You have to find the things that challenge you, that grab you, that you want to pursue, look for yourself. On the research, the person hasn't been able to do, sure, it's fine. If you get involved in things other than research, it takes time, which means there's things you'd like to do. You have to decide where you want to be a human being as well as a scientist.
On the issue of whether DOD could be a voice or influence on the Republicans about climate change. I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, there are some Republicans who probably want to be not such naysayers. There was this Republican senator who asked the chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who happened to be an MIT PhD, Alison McFarland, and told her not to use the two words together, climate and change, in anything that she spoke about. Yes, and there's a possibility. In fact, Pentagon has now created, under Chuck Hagel, before he left, a line of funding for climate change. And I think it's similar to the National Highway, Defense Highway kind of thing. And maybe that is practically is a good thing. Maybe they want to shift some money into the climate work, and I would welcome it.
Okay, so,
Oh, sorry, the question.
Norfolk Naval Base are going to be underwater.
Harry Howland, CSL MIT. So I agree that, ideally military funding would be abolished. Not ideal. In an ideal world, I would also agree that the state capital should be abolished and we should replace it with workers' councils. We have a problem though, and so this is a very personal issue that my research field, which is privacy enhancing technologies, cryptography, and cybersecurity, has been dealing with. Almost all of that funding comes from either the State Department, who want to use these tools to overthrow regimes they don't like, Iran, China, etc. They want to see it fit here in Tiananmen, or from DoD, DARPA. So the funding structures for all the open source software used by WikiLeaks and by Snowden was actually, ironically, funded by the military-industrial complex. The nonprofit sector doesn't seem to have much interest. Private sector doesn't really understand it and would sell snake oil on the second. And individual funders aren't really donating very much. So if you're in my situation, which is you have a nonprofit, you're working on open source software, you want to enable the next Snowden to happen, would you or would you not take DARPA or State Department funding?
I can answer that easily. Because I was in the same situation when I got here in the 1950s, and for many years afterwards, as was my friend Mark Sally. We had a choice that we could, go work in a local restaurant, or we could take money from the Pentagon. And I personally saw nothing wrong with taking money. The question is what you do, not who's paying for it. Because when you're getting money from the Pentagon, you're just getting it from the taxpayer. And if you get it from the NIH, you're getting it from the taxpayer. If you work on biological warfare for the NIH, it's wrong. If you work on developing software under Pentagon funding, it's right.
Would you have any particular guidelines? So for example, I believe in open source, but I don't know if you have any particular guidelines for researchers who are in this ethical dilemma. A lot of us are in.
The guidelines should be, what am I doing?
Well, it's a bit vague, but it's
The bureaucratic arrangement is made in Washington about where the money comes from. There's just no such thing as clean money.
My question is for Professor Chomsky. So during the Vietnam conflict, you mentioned that the MIT administration got out of the conflict by setting up a committee. Do you think the recently presidentially convened MIT climate change conversation that's going on this year is another strategy to get out of confrontation?
Could you repeat that?
Do you think the presidentially convened MIT climate change conversation is another strategy to get out of confrontation, perhaps in response to the fossil fuel divestment campaign that's going on?
Could be more conversation and dialogue instead of confrontation.
Should there be more conversation about the climate change issue?
No, is the conversation a strategy to get out of confrontation?
This conversation is strategy.
Should there be more discussion of strategy? Why don't you answer?
If I heard you correctly, you were saying, could conversation be a strategy? Is that correct or not?
Presidential conversation.
If I understood your question, the question was, in analogy, what happened with the Palm Commission was a way somehow to stop this strong confrontation with the student, to calm it down. So you made a commission. So now today there was this request for divestment by the fossil free MIT group, and then the MIT decided to set up a conversation, maybe to calm it down and to avoid a strong confrontation.
So
Depends how the conversation goes. It really is that sort. I mean, it's better than Harvard, where the president just said, we're not going to do it. So there's an opening, and we can make use of it. The question is, how do you make use of it? It's a possibility, the opportunity's there, and here's the chance to bring out the issues, reach the student body, reach the faculty, reach out in the community, keep taught in high schools, all sorts of things. So the opportunities are there. The rest is what to do with it.
I just want to add a note to that about the Pounds Commission report. Professor Chomsky was a very eloquent dissent on that. But the Pounds Commission was followed by the Feshbach Commission in the mid-'80s, when the Star Wars debate started and President Reagan was putting lots of money in this totally science fiction projects that had no basis in physics most of the time. But the point that I want to make is these two commissions kind of became, for MIT administration, it seems to me, I was not there, is kicking the can down the road. Means this was a commission is a great way to deal with a problem that you don't want to really solve. And you make a commission, and you have a blue ribbon commission, whatever commission that the federal government sets up all the time. So the basic recommendations of Pounds Commission, even that there should be more transparency on research on campus, really didn't happen. I tried to find all kinds of information today, even go to the electrical engineering and computer science department website, because they're one of the heaviest recipients of Pentagon funds, just to see specifically what type of projects are going on, etc. I can't find very, very little information. So the transparency on campus, I think, is the first step towards addressing any of these issues.
Well, actually, if you take a look, what the Pounds Commission found was that there was transparency on campus outside of the political science. Things were, undoubtedly there were things that people weren't talking about, but basically it was pretty transparent. And that continued for some years. In fact, got better. And then it started getting worse. But I think the reason it started getting worse, if you look into it, will probably be corporate funding. Because corporate funding is unlikely to be transparent. I mean, when the government's not a wonderful institution, but when they do something, it's generally with the intention of the benefit of the general economy. doesn't necessarily mean you and me, but the general economy, corporates, whatever. When a corporation funds something, they typically want it themselves. But they're not a charitable organization. And there are various ways of directing funding so that it tends to give more applied short-term results, not 30 years from now, like developing computers, and for them, not for their competitors. So I think if anyone looks into it, I don't know if anyone has carefully, you probably find that that may well be the source of the lack of transparency.
So there are other 5 questions, and I think these 5 questions will be the last for today, but we can continue our conversation on May 5th.
Hi, Priyanka Chatterjee. I'm a senior undergrad here at MIT in mechanical engineering. This question is for both professors, but whichever professor would be more interested in talking, both please do. With the onset of an actually already manifested climate crisis we're facing and will face more and more in the future, and a potentially mandatory focus and clean energy focus on nuclear energy, what is your take on the advent of nuclear power for our very low carbon, hopefully low carbon, if not zero carbon, energy needs in relation to nuclear weapons and an increase in the defense/military capacity? And do you approve of the focus on nuclear energy as like a focus in R&D for energy and how that could potentially be used for military purposes? And do you see that as something good? Or as in something?
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. I was in Japan 3 weeks ago to attend a meeting organized by the Japanese Scientists Association on lessons learned from Fukushima. It was really a touching meeting for me, and I think it helped me move a lot closer to a position to really have not have nuclear power, especially in countries like Japan, for instance, which is heavily earthquake prone. There are actually better ways now. I mean, unless we can come up with a real solution for the waste. You know, in this country, we have 104 operating nuclear reactors with spent fuel pools, about every one of them that are overflowing almost, and we have no place to put them. It's a highly dangerous situation, highly expensive situation. When we move the spent fuel from there to wherever we put them, whether it is in Carlsbad or whether it's in Yucca Mountain, it will be a tremendous effort to be able to do it. The point I would make is for scientists to take a look is that the alternatives are actually beginning to become feasible. If you look at Japan, and or especially if you look at Germany, how this transition is happening from a highly energy-intensive, dependent economy, an economy that was dependent on nuclear power, away from nuclear power, making it economically feasible, I think that's the route we should take. In the meantime, though, there are other countries that are going heavily nuclear, China, India. So research on the safety of nuclear reactors, etc., must continue, and we are unfortunately in a situation where nuclear engineering departments are disappearing because there are no jobs mostly in this country.
Actually, just a brief comment. I think you can find what seemed to me at least pretty good commentary on this in the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is one of the groups that grew out of the turmoil at MIT in 1970. Continuing with
So thank you to the both of you for highlighting how MIT could be take a part in greater social change, not only through its research, but also through its moral leadership. And that's one of the things that I feel of a graduate student. And I think sometimes the Institute, perhaps many of the professors on the science or engineering side, sometimes underestimate the impact we could have from our moral leadership, such as actions through divestment, for instance, where since we can't put a clean number to its effects, we kind of disregard it or don't feel comfortable with taking those kind of actions. Do do you see a way of perhaps helping the side that understands that not everything can have be evaluated through an exact number, like from the political science or social science departments, helping the rest of the institute understand how not only its research but moral leadership is imperative to challenges like climate change? Like, how do you approach that? How would you recommend that conversation to continue?
I think it's more of a philosophical question. I think Professor Chomsky is how do you make this moral imperative on the especially issues of climate change?
Ask people if they care whether their grandchildren are going to be above water. That's a moral imperative. It's a very real issue. It's close, it's dangerous. If we get over a tipping point, it's finished. We have a decision to make for the first time in human history. It's now time to decide whether upcoming generations will have a possibility of decent survival, let alone the rest of the species in the world. And species destruction already is at the rate of about 60 million years ago when an asteroid hit the Earth, and it's going to get worse. I don't know what more of a moral imperative there can be than that. I think the problem is not the moral imperative, it's the ignorance. People simply don't know. When they read the news, I picked this morning's newspaper, there's a front page story on the Pope Francis, who's apparently going to issue an encyclical suggesting to the people of the world that they pay some attention to impending disaster. If you read the column, it's almost entirely about condemnations of it. Okay, no, you shouldn't do this, science isn't said, none of your business, and so on and so forth. Well, what are people supposed to believe when they read that? They're supposed to believe he says, she says. It's a dispute. I'm not a scientist, how do I know? That's the kind of situation in which a strong statement from a place like MIT can make a difference.
Hello, my name is Noam Cabral. I'm a senior, undergrad 463. And my question pertains to using the defense label. As you said before, the defense label seems to be very effective at persuading people to get something funded. And with the establishment at the Pentagon of a committee specifically designed to handle climate change, it sounds like we're finally going to use the defense label and apply it to climate change. Now, my question is, why has it taken so long to do something like that, to apply defense as a label for climate change? And do you think that's the effective way that will convince the American public to finally get on board with addressing this issue?
Why has it taken so long to put defense label out?
People like us, you and me, aren't doing it. That's why it's taken so long. Like every other issue. Why did it take so long to develop the opposition to the Vietnam War or any other issue? It's not going to happen by itself. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Doctor, my question is to Professor Chomsky. You have a great way of putting together apparently disparate issues. And with what's in the news regarding the riots in Baltimore, I was wondering if you could make any connections between the topics tonight being military spending and climate change and what's going on in Baltimore and the riots that take place in some of the other cities like Ferguson. So I have a feeling you can make a connection.
Pick any two things and there's some connection between the police are getting militarized. That's a fact. Small police departments have SWAT teams. I've seen right in Cambridge things on the police department look to me like tanks. I don't think they're there, it's part of a kind of, actually it's policy to militarize the police, surplus weapons and so on. And this all has effect on, the race issue is a very deep one. We have never come to terms with it. You don't have to look at Baltimore, take a look at prisons. Why are the prisons full of black males? Why since 1980, though not before, has U.S. prison population shot up way beyond any other country in the world? One of the reasons for that. A racist drug war. Racist drug war designed that way. And it's a continuation of other racist policies that go back to the foundation of the country. It's one of the things we haven't come to terms with many, is that our economy, our wealth and privilege, yours and mine, is based very substantially on slave labor camps that were so vicious that the Nazis were impressed for a long period. Take a look at economic history. It's based on a cotton production for a long period that fueled not only the slave labor owners, the plantation owners, but the commercial system, the financial system, the industrial system, the big industrial installations. They had Lowell or textile mills, not only here, but in England. This went on for a century, and then it continues afterwards with other forms of criminalized, a slave labor force that was criminalized after Reconstruction, 1877. The South was basically authorized to criminalize black life and created another slave labor system, which was even better for the owners because we didn't have to reproduce your cattle. The state did for a large part of the American Industrial Revolution of the late 19th, early 20th century. And it goes right to the present. These are really deep issues. It's not just the policeman who shoots too much. These are very deep issues in the whole culture and society, and we have not come to terms with.
Any last question?
My name is Kenny Friedman. I'm an undergrad in electrical engineering and computer science. And my question is, since the public perception of Silicon Valley and bureaucracy of academia, the vast majority of my peers think that the way to work on, or are planning on working on cutting edge research in industry and not in academia. Do you think these structural changes that you're talking about would help shift the focus and the public perception back towards academia for cutting edge research?
I think that's the, ultimately, the good research part of that big pyramid, which is called upside down pyramid, because you have a very small portion that's keeping it alive, this huge wasteful structure, about 80 billion or so. This 2 billion is producing probably a lot more research than anything else in that 80 billion. So I think bringing attention to that, I think is extremely important, and will bring back real science to our research, which is beginning to erode. Professor Chomsky had to leave because he was supposed to leave at 8:30. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Radius. Thank you to Friends of the People. Thank you to Subrata. Thank you to Noam. And I hope to see many of you maybe for our follow-up meeting.
Every one of these questions had to have